So good morning, everybody. Great to see many of you here, even though virtually. This is the panel that starts on 10:45, entitled Sexual Politics. I am Professor Naoko. I am Associate Professor of History and also the Director of Asian Pacific American Studies Program here at Michigan State University. So we have 4 papers in this panel with 5 presenters. So I like to promptly start by introducing all the panelists at the start, and then we will have plenty of discussion time left after all 4 presentations are completed. Just so that the panelists are aware of this, I will be letting you all know about the time. Toward the end of your presentation, that should be 15 minutes each. Please be aware that there may be some message coming your way from me. With that said, let me start to introduce our wonderful lineup of panelists today. So our first presenter is Natalia Niedmann Alvarez. Natalia, she, her pronouns, is a JSD candidate at the University of Chicago Law School. Her dissertation surveys how US feminist movements turned to constitutional debates during the late 20th century influenced their political imagination. Her research focuses on the intersection of law, history, and political theory, and her paper today is titled Aborting Rights for Politics. Our second presenter is Anna Forringer-Beal. Anna Forringer-Beal, she, her pronouns, is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge Center for Gender Studies. Her work focuses on the construction of the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. This has drawn her into the history of human trafficking policy in Britain, critical theory, and feminist legal studies. Her presentation today is called Voting Out Human Trafficking: How White Supremacy Was Used to Argue for Women's Suffrage and Against Trafficking in England. Our third presenter is Professor Lina Qu, she, her pronouns. She's an assistant professor of Chinese at Michigan State University. She studies modern Chinese literature and culture and specializes in women's writing, cinema, and media. She's authored several articles, including Writing, Rewriting, and Miswriting, Eileen Chan's Late Style Against the Grain, and Waste on the Tip of the Tongue, Social Eating Live Streams in the Age of Chinese Affluence. She is currently working on her first book manuscript, tentatively titled Genealogy of Hungry Women Writers and Artists, Rethinking Chinese Modernity Through the Art of Female Hunger. Her presentation today is called I Am Not Madame Bovary, and I Struggle for My Reproductive and Marital Rights. Our last presentation has 2 presenters, Lauren Han, she, hers, and Sarah Morel, also she, hers. Lauren Han is a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Michigan. Her work explores political learning in online spaces and the ways in which new media technologies empower women and other marginalized groups to reconfigure modes of civic engagement and ideas about politics. Sarah Morel is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. Her dissertation uses a mix of surveys, experiments, and interviews to evaluate the role of candidate training programs in encouraging more women to run for political office. Their presentation is titled All in the Family: The Effects of Familial Attitudes on Women's Support for Pro-Women Politics. So welcome again, everybody, to this wonderful panel this morning. So let's start with Natalia's presentation, Aborting Rights for Politics. Natalia?
Thank you, Naoko. Let me just share my screen. Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the conference organizers and everyone on the panel for their magnificent work adapting everything to the new circumstances, and I look forward to our discussion. This presentation is part of a larger research endeavor. As Naoko mentioned, the project explores what have been the effects of judicializing feminist demands in the US. And my intuition is that the privatizing grammar of judicial rights, understood as entitlements that correspond to some people in a pre-existing order, limits political imagination by overemphasizing aspects of inclusion rather than systematic transformation. Thus, translating feminist demands to judicially manageable terms may weaken the potential of those aims. Aborting Rights for Politics is a short introduction to this project in which I will lay out summarily, first, the place that the judicialization of abortion came to occupy in feminist politics, and second, what it is we lose in a rights-limited framing. I will look back into some feminist projects of the 70s and how they overflow the judicial rights rhetoric. So first, let me begin with some points about Roe. Roe versus Wade, the landmark case that recognized women's constitutional right of privacy, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy, was decided on Monday, January 22nd of 1973. The following day, the New York Times included several headlines related to the abortion ruling on its cover. As you can see in the slide, High Court rules abortions legal, state bans ruled out, national guidelines, cardinal shocked, ruling seems to forestall abortion, debate in Albany. But nowhere in the cover, not in the headlines and not in the body, were the words Roe or Wade ever mentioned. In fact, in the entire newspaper that featured over 8 sections on the subject, the words Roe or Wade were only uttered twice. The first one in the presentation of the experts of the case, Roe versus Wade. And the second one in an extract that said, in the Texas case, Jane Roe, an unmarried pregnant woman who was allowed to bring the case without further identity, was the only plaintiff. This insipid expression starkly contrasts with the place Roe and abortion came to occupy in the public discourse. Many things changed as time passed, and the generic Texas became the unmistakable Roe versus Wade, making it even into a Grammy Award-winning movie. As Roe emerged as a symbol of women's emancipation, however incomplete, and settled in the spotlight of feminist politics, alternative and more capacious political projects and formulations were forgotten. I want to look back into some of these alternative framings. For this, I will briefly go over 3 feminist efforts under the broad category of care, specifically child care, and how it allowed for a reimagination of the social division of labor outside the judicial rights framing. First, let me start with the National Organization of Women. It was founded in 1967 and intended to be the NAACP for women, advancing their cause through the courts. The organization's 1968 Bill of Rights asserted 8 rights. Among these, the demand for childcare centers was framed as a universal concern, stating, and I quote, "Childcare facilities be established by law on the same basis as parks, libraries, and public schools." And then it continued, "as a community resource to be used by all citizens from all income levels." It is interesting how, though framed in terms of right, the appeal to a branch distinct from the judiciary allowed for a more capacious understanding of the extent of the so-called right. The addressee of the proposal, whether rhetoric or real, is no doubt Congress, which allowed for a more seizable and structural ambition. The Bill of Rights is currently recounted in one of the 1967 entries of the organization's historical highlights on their web. As you can see, I have printed a screen cap of the page. This page features the equivalent of 8 printed pages of now's most relevant undertakings during the 40-year period that goes between 1966 and 2006. A detail that is illustrative of the organization's priorities today is how in the highlights, the word childcare is only mentioned twice. You can see there it's highlighted once. Out of the 40 years of achievements and struggle, childcare only made it to the headlines on 2 occasions. Unlike other far more cited terms, such as abortion, which appears 17 times, equal rights amendment 22 times, or the word right or rights, which appears 42 times. Far less frequent are mentions of welfare, which appears 4 times, race 2 times, or social security, only mentioned once. It is also noted, and this is expressive, and this is just an example of a broader shown of the organization's current priorities. But what is notable is how, besides the mention in the Bill of Rights, the other allusion to childcare in the highlights appears concerning the failed Child Care Act, a bill that Nixon vetoed and, according to Now's website, termed the Sovietization of American children. Although Nixon didn't actually say those words, they did appear in one of the discarded drafts of his presidential veto. In 1971, Congress approved the Comprehensive Child Development Act, what now termed the Child Care Act, on its web. That was the closest the demand of the organization's Bill of Rights came to be realized in the United States. The legislation would have laid the foundations for universal childcare by including broadly available free daycare and an even larger sliding tuition system. The picture of Nixon you see in the presentation slide is actually of him vetoing a different bill of health and education, but the outlawing social legislation smile must not have been that different for this bill. He vetoed the Comprehensive Child Development Act, saying that the government ought to instead propose a policy, and I quote, consciously designed to cement the family in its rightful position as the keystone of our civilization. Albeit somewhat paranoidly, Nixon rightly intuited the discussion was not just about custodial solutions for kids, but one much broader about social structure and organization. The dream of Now was thus crushed, and with it, its aspirations for non-focalized policies. But fairly funded daycare was but one option. A second alternative, growing in popularity in the early 70s, was that of self-managed popular daycares. Many local organizations started to put together childcare cooperatives. These were parent-worker controlled and would provide a liberated, anti-racist, anti-sexist education. A notable case was that of the Silver Lake Playgroup, founded by Ruth Beaglehole, who left her job at a wealthy Beverly Hills neighborhood to start a daycare in her own working-class neighborhood. She recycled some of the furniture the wealthy nursery had disposed and began her venture by meeting several days a week in a park. They later rented a garage and then two, and as the waitlist started growing. Another example was the Kansas City Daycare, a parent cooperative entirely run by non-hierarchical cooperation of parents and volunteers. It intended to enable children to relate to multiple adults on an equal basis, and not just one parental authority. The daycare also purported to present an environment that ideally reflects no gender, cultural, racial, and class distinctions in a space of love, security, and support. A very interesting feature of cooperatives was their commitment with self-management and existence, to the extent possible, independently from the state. This wish of self-sustainability crushed with the material reality of scarce resources, which often forced them to search for outside funding in the form of grants or subsidies. But the aspiration to self-sustainment, communal funding, and managing expresses how the project was not just about a practical response to parents' need to leave their kids somewhere as they left for work, but the rehearsing of an alternative social order, one that was protagonized by local communities. As multiple local projects emerged, also national efforts to support and enhance them were divulged. The Women's Action Alliance, an organization designed to provide resources, assistance, and referral services to women and local groups all around the US, published a brochure on how to organize a childcare center. The package included information on how to manage a budget, organizational aspects, as well as materials to enable communities to provide high-quality daycare that educates to eliminate racism, sexism, and classism. Other groups, motivated by the decentralization and reformulation of the family as the basic social unit, moved to communes, where child caring would be equally shared among all the adult members of the community. This practice relatively frequent in the 60s and continued through the 70s with a renewed feminist perspective. As I have sketched, through the communal collaboration, original projects of local power and meaning emerge as alternatives to the status quo in the form of popular daycare and communes. Finally, I want to briefly reflect on a third project active during the mid-70s. The New York Wages for Housework Committee and the Black Wages for Housework Committee were two Brooklyn-based groups of the Wages for Housework International campaign that agitated and mobilized during the 70s. They demanded from the government wages for housework to all women. The campaign was an optic, a perspective that allowed the questioning of the socioeconomical division of labor. By refocusing the attention in the unwaged character, but not nature, of housework, the campaign turned the categories that allowed for exploitation in the home upside down. Thus, care was no longer a task that naturally corresponded to women, but a socially imposed unwaged responsibility. By resituating women within the chain of production, Wages for Housework offered a material critique of the distribution of wage labor and care in society. As the pamphlet highlighted in the slide puts it, the women of the world are serving notice. We clean your homes and factories. We raise the next generations of workers for you. In return for our work, you have only asked us to work harder. We intend to get paid, and we are serving notice that if we don't, we will simply refuse to work any longer. The campaigns trying to make the existing social organizations shiver by studying for concrete policy alternatives that materialize their broader political project. An example is how they agitated against welfare cuts, as welfare was the first wages for housework that women were actually receiving. This included, but was not limited to, demands for quality housing, as eloquently expressed in one of the pamphlets, a workplace we pay rent for, a demand for vacations from housework, welfare as the first wages for housework, all-day free daycare centers, free and non-coerced medical care, and of course, wages for housework, now and retroactive. In short, for the campaign, a new world had to be established and a new form of social organization that lived up to the promise of real justice. As I hope this brief outline has somewhat illustrated, throughout the 70s, feminist activism prefigured alternative social and economic arrangements and institutions. I have focused on projects I grouped under the category of care, but there are a myriad of other ways and perspectives through which feminist politics sought to transform the world. Even the more liberal and moderate positions, here portrayed in the National Organization of Women, seem to have held room during the 70s for universalist aspirations. My objective is not to defend any of these projects in particular as a feasible or desirable political alternative today, but to underline their richness. Of course, feminist political imagination and impetus did not completely end after the time period I have just reviewed. Nonetheless, the contrast between the variety, magnitude, and scope of feminist projects during the 70s and the alternatives that seem to be available today in the American discourse, I believe, speaks to one of the shortcomings of overemphasizing judicial rights. By overestimating the significance of court-granted rights instead of structurally transforming feminist institutions, we lose sight of the fact that an altogether different world is possible, and not just a discretely better one. In this presentation, I have sketched the significance of the advent of Roe versus Wade as a momentous political event, a gravitational focus of feminist politics far greater than could have been anticipated with the dictation of the generic abortion decisions of the unmarried women of the Texas case. I assume abortion as a constitutionally entrenched right, that is, a formally recognized right, however lacking in terms of material access, occupies a significant position in present American feminist politics. I have outlined some examples I hope can shed a light over how structured political imagination was more abundant among feminist groups during the 70s. And my hypothesis is that these two phenomena are not independent, and that the overemphasizing of the language of courts and court-granted rights might have been prejudicial for the conceiving of more radical world-transforming alternatives, including institutions that radically transform the world and not just discretely improve our position in it. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for your fascinating presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, we will have plenty of time for Q&As after all presentations are completed. So if you have a question for Natalia or anybody else, please hold on to those questions so that you won't forget. You have a chance to ask those questions after all the presentations are done. So next presenter is Anna Forringer-Beal. So Anna, would you like to start?
I'm so sorry, I'm running into some technical difficulties. I think I might have to rejoin in just a moment so that Zoom will allow me to share screen while recording. Apologies about that.
The perks of having online conferences.
Right.
Yeah, somebody told me that if you don't run into a problem like this, it's not a real Zoom conference. So I think it is a real Zoom conference after all.
We're establishing our authenticity right now.
Exactly. Oh, here you are, Anna. So do you think, we can see you. It looks like you are muted right now. Yes, great.
Oh, apologies about that. Okay, great. Sorry for the technical difficulty. You're seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Excellent, cool. All right, I'll make it larger. Wonderful, thank you. Sorry about that delay. I heard someone talk about bringing authenticity to the room, so here we are. So thank you, Natalia, for that really wonderful presentation. I'm excited to share mine with you all. And so what I have for you today is just one aspect of a larger project on the history of human trafficking policy in Britain that I'm working on. But what drew me to study how English suffragettes included the campaign against human trafficking in the pursuit of the vote is that white suffragettes sat at this really interesting nexus between victim, rescuer, and perpetrator in their retelling of white slavery narratives. And while I will go into further definition about white slavery later on, it is essentially a term used by English social reformers at the turn of the 20th century for the forced prostitution of women. I argue that the space where the suffrage movement intersects with campaigns against white slavery offers an important site of study to better understand how white femininity functions simultaneously as a site of racial privilege and gendered subjugation under patriarchal norms. Furthermore, I would argue that in anti-white slavery campaigns, British suffragettes reproduced white supremacist tropes about immigrants. This was to the detriment both of trafficking victims and to the suffragettes' own political cause. Understanding how race and gender function within the context of white slavery and suffrage allows us further insights into how we understand white saviorism and the political power of white women today. So I'd like to just take a moment and tell you a little bit more about my current project to provide some context for how I approach researching English suffragettes and their activism. Suffrage is not the main interest of my work, to be blunt about it. Rather, I focus on the UK Modern Slavery Act, a comprehensive anti-trafficking law introduced by Theresa May in 2015. My research aims to deepen our understanding of the history of this act by tracing the lineages of trafficking back to their roots in the white slavery panics. It's my goal that by connecting this genealogy to contemporary discourse, we can create new strategies to reduce trafficking. But while conducting this archival analysis, I was really surprised by how the names of prominent white English suffragettes like Josephine Butler or Millicent Fawcett were referenced by anti-white slavery groups. I became curious about this intersection between suffrage and white slavery as a social causes. And this is what my presentation will focus on. But before I continue on to the findings, I'm very much overdue for a definition of white slavery, which it turns out might actually be a bit of an overpromise, because the definition of white slavery in the English context, or single definition, proves elusive. While a popular sensationalized version of the term often repeated xenophobic renditions of white women being sold into prostitution by foreign men, campaigns against white slavery actually fought a host of different social ills that could be considered today as things like child sexual abuse, kidnapping, sexual assault, and workplace harassment. So perhaps it's best to focus on the words themselves. The prefix white was chosen by early campaigners to connote the purity and innocence of white slavery victims. Slavery was chosen because it conjured images of enslaved Black people forced into the transatlantic slave trade. The hope was that this phrase would generate an emotive response from the general populace. This was a discursive political strategy that was also employed by suffragettes, who used the term slavery to refer to women's role in marriage or to campaign against sweated labor of women in exploitative factory conditions, which is actually what this image is of. There has been significant popular critique, and I would argue very rightfully so, of collapsing the experiences and sufferings of enslaved Black people into a tool for furthering white women's rights, or in the case of white slavery, advancing the anti-trafficking agenda. Following this line of critique, I would argue that the prefix white of white slavery serves to differentiate the exploitation of women within England from the enslavement of Black people. White becomes a signifier for the second term slavery as a kind of crime that is adjacent to, but not the same as, the transatlantic slave trade. This co-optation of the word slavery is a form of epistemic violence in which white slavery advocates attempt to place their campaign on higher moral ground. By aligning the idea of British whiteness, which itself is a mutable social construct, with whiteness as a form of purity, innocence, or virginity, the term white slavery becomes a catch-all for crimes against women that could be read as crimes against whiteness itself. The white woman's body becomes nothing more than a conduit for the British border in the process. Perhaps the National Vigilance Association, an anti-white slavery group, could best summarize the argument themselves. In the 1911 report, they respond that the cheapening of white womanhood is one of the worst features of white slave traffic, and that this must result in some cheapening of the prestige of the British Empire. White slavery then became a tool through which white English people could reinscribe their power and exercise their fear over the racial other. In other words, white supremacy campaigns functioned as a way to maintain white racial supremacy within Britain. This is reflected by the many reports published featuring immigrants as perpetrators. For example, William T. Stead's sensational 1885 report, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, featured stories of women's corrupted into vice by foreign or drunk men. He also extensively references London East End as an epicenter for white slavery, when this area was known for its large immigrant communities and high poverty rates. In these reports, the specter of the foreign other becomes the corrupting force for white British women. These feminized and violated bodies are a stand-in for the nation. I also really like that the accompanying image to Maiden Tribute is this white man who stands as the champion of injured innocence, this kind of patriarchal need for control. So all this is to support a definition of white slavery that focuses on the production of social identity and the retelling of the crime. Feminist scholar Jo DeMoza proposes a definition of white slavery that centers on the role of the victim. She writes that the white slave / victim of trafficking is immediately recognizable in her role as subject of a melodramatic narrative. However, she proves more elusive when, wrestled from her narrative context, she becomes the subject of social scientific inquiry. The subject of white slavery narratives that offers a canvas for social scientific inquiry is crucial to the definition of white slavery. This is what allowed campaigners to turn away from white British women as the sole victims, and in a curious turn, preoccupy themselves with the movement of Jewish and Eastern European women within Britain. While these migrant women may have passed as white, were not considered racially white at the time. As I have mentioned, whiteness is a changeable social category made up of unearned power and privileges. Non-British women were seen as racial others and treated as threats to the white British culture. White slavery campaigners argued that these women were inherently more susceptible to immorality and vice. They feared that this would corrupt British women. Therefore, they argued, immigrant women must be monitored at all times when moving through Britain. Under the veil of protecting women against white slavery, anti-trafficking groups during the 20th century actually set up Britain's first immigrant surveillance network, which seemed to be more preoccupied with maintaining Britain's cultural whiteness than actually helping victims. In this way, white slavery became a tool to maintain cultural dominance and white supremacy. One of the largest anti-white slavery groups that took on monitoring victims, assisting women with legal fees, and raiding brothels, among a bunch of other things, was the National Vigilance Association. Founded in 1885 by Alexander Coote, who's pictured here, the NVA saw itself as a protector for British women. In doing so, its practices took on a profoundly anti-immigrant approach. In support of the 1905 Aliens Act, which would then go on to restrict the entry of Jewish migrants into Britain, the NVA released a 6-month report on their work monitoring ports of entry. This report was presented to the British Home Office and opened by saying that, "In the course of our work, we have for a long time been convinced that the foreign criminals, both men and women, are a dangerous menace to our social, moral, and national life. The terrible condition of the streets of London was almost exclusively due to their presence." Given white slavery's foundation in xenophobia and racism, I was surprised to see the names of suffragettes popping up in the National Vigilance Association archives. One of the women most heavily involved with the group was Josephine Butler, a prominent social reformer and suffragette. Butler had become involved as a champion against white slavery early on, even before the founding of the NBA. In the early 1870s, when white slavery was just beginning to enter British consciousness through stories of English women being held against their will within Belgian brothels, Josephine Butler offered her home in Liverpool as shelter for victims of white slavery. She also wrote a letter petitioning the British Foreign Secretary for better monitoring of Belgian officials to prevent the traffic of women. Her petition received over 1,000 signatures. Then, during the campaign promoting the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, Josephine Butler and Alexander Coote spoke at a rally in Hyde Park, promoting the act as a measure against white slavery. It was that year that Butler joined the National Vigilance Association. As a member of the NVA's executive committee, Butler oversaw the activities of the organization. It is worth noting that Butler would later go on to distance herself from the NVA, citing their tendency to blame women for their own victimization, but not connecting this with the NVA's treatment of foreign nationals. Millicent Fawcett, who would go on to be the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffragette Societies, one of the largest suffragette societies of Britain, was also a member of the National Vigilance Association. Like Butler, she became involved with the effort early on against white slavery as a way to protect women from abuse. Under Fawcett's leadership, the National Union would also campaign against white slavery using the NVA's racist approach. In 1913, the National Union produced the pamphlet, The White Slave Traffic, and asked its readers to imagine the fate of an English girl in a South American port at the mercy of all colors, of the mercy of all men, of all colors, and of all nationalities. Here, the English victim is transported beyond Britain's national borders, but remains representative of the nation nonetheless, through its colonial pursuits. The threat of the non-white perpetrator continues to serve as a threat against English national power and control. Using this fear as motivation for political action, the National Union argued that the only way to prevent the white slave trade would be to allow white women the vote. It was argued that the inherent virtue and morality of white women would compel them to vote against vice and white slave traffic. As the pamphlet concludes, "Give British women the vote and the right to insist that the prayer of the white slave prisoners and captives shall no longer go unheard." The campaign against white slavery was picked up by the larger suffragette movement as well. The Museum of London holds a great collection of woodblock prints created by the Suffrage Atelier, a women's artist collective that operated in the homes of different women between 1909 and 1914. The Atelier produced banners, prints, and hosted lectures for suffrage campaigners. The art was intended to be reproduced and raise awareness for the cause. Oh, this, one of the block prints. White slavery was a common theme in their work. As you can see from this print called The Appeal of Womanhood, a serene woman stands holding a sign that reads, "We want the vote to stop the white slave traffic, sweated labor, and to save the children." The figure of the suffragette stands in front of a huddled group of women, presumably victim of these crimes, with Parliament looming in the background. The white suffragette is perfectly positioned to be a savior of these victims. Both her gender and her race work to establish her as a moral arbiter of justice, ready at a moment's notice to help the women behind her. While this heroine might sound appealing or even necessary, we must remain cautious of the tendency of white people to rush in and rescue people of color from themselves. This same narrative is repeated in a second woodblock print that reimagines the suffrage fight against white slavery as the Greek myth of Perseus saving Andromeda from the sea monster. In this image, Perseus, labeled as women's suffrage, wields Medusa's head, labeled equal rights, against the sea monster of white slavery. Andromeda is unmarked, but presumably a stand-in for the victims. The statement next to the image reminds the reader that the only solution to the white slave traffic is women's suffrage. And we must remember that this was white women's suffrage. What strikes me as most salient about this image is the gender inversion of the women suffragettes into the male body of Perseus. The gender conversion, undoubtedly a queer turn to this argument, invokes Spivak's infamous phrase, white women saving brown men from brown women from brown men. Here we are no longer talking about white men saving brown women or racially othered women, but white women instead usurping white men's patriarchal and white supremacist power. Rather than undoing the interconnected social structures of sexism and white supremacy, suffragettes campaigning against white slavery reinforced these structures by asserting their own moral superiority and through their dismissal of racially minoritized women. This was considerably harmful to immigrant women in particular, and furthermore, it did not help the suffragettes further their own political cause. In their promotion of the 1912 Criminal Law Amendment Act, also known as the White Slavery Act, suffragettes continued to make the argument that the instinctual morality of white women would make them great champions against white slavery, if only they were given the vote. However, Baron Arthur Lee, an anti-suffragist and member of parliament, used their argument against him. He reasoned that the vote for women was unnecessary if men worked to end the white slave trade themselves. In the House of Commons debate, he supported the 1912 Act, reflecting that suffrage for women only made sense if it could be said, and said truly, that men are callous to the sufferings of women and not willing to accord them even an elementary measure of protection. So in conclusion, I would argue that the suffragettes campaigning against white slavery ended up reproducing systems of white supremacy that both harmed actual victims of white slavery and hindered their own cause. This carries important considerations for how we approach today's anti-trafficking sector and the white saviorism that is still evident within the field. Moving forward, it is important to understand the histories of white slavery in order to avoid repeating its mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your great presentation. So our next presenter is Lina. Lina, are you ready?
Yes, I think so. Let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen and hear me? Great. First, thanks so much for the organizer of this conference, and special thanks to Professor Waki for her kind introduction. Being a literary and cultural scholar, my approach is slightly different from other panelists. So my project heavily relies on discursive and visual analysis. And the goal today is to see how fiction can engage us in discussions about women's reproductive justice in China. So this is the title of my presentation. I'm Not a Madame Bovary is a movie released in 2016. So the movie, directed by Feng Xiaogang, revolves around the female protagonist Li Xuelian and her strenuous journey of petitioning. The story begins a year after Li Xuelian and her husband had filed their divorce agreement. Back then, the couple conceived a plan to game the system, that is to make the husband, in order to make the husband eligible for the apartment unit that they both wanted, they faked a divorce. When they would reunite eventually, the belief that they both could live in that apartment. But the husband soon betrayed their plan. he fell in love with and got married with someone else during the break and moved into the cherished apartment with his new wife, leaving Li Xuelian out in the cold. In other words, their fake divorce become real for good. And so begins Li Xuelian's journey of petitioning. She first asked the county court to nullify her fake divorce so that he could divorce the husband honestly and properly. After her case being dismissed, she starts to petition the authorities from the provincial level to the central level for redressing her grievances. She sues each person who refuses to help her, eventually suing people all the way up to the capital city, Beijing. She became a royal pen to the various provincial officials, judges, and mayors. She races out in front of their cars, shouting injustice. She holds up a sign, right? This is a sign here, writes injustice, or yuan in Chinese. And she also appears at the party conferences in Beijing like clockwork. So they all dread seeing her. Li Xuelian's journey comes to a halt when out of sudden her former husband died from a car accident. Li's relentlessness has perplexed everyone until she finally discloses the truth of her fake divorce towards the end of the movie. Rather than committing fraud, Li and her husband decided to fake a divorce to circumvent the draconian one-child policy under which one couple could only have one child. And they want to legally give birth to a second child that was conceived out of plan. Being outraged of her husband's betrayal, Li subsequently had a late miscarriage and lost her second child. The absurd story of Li Xuelian evidences the human costs of China's population control policy, which disrupts family life and social order. Li vents her frustration and anger first at husband and then at the officials when there are no channels to vindicate her reproductive justice. The story about this one woman's tireless attempt to go up against the bureaucratic system is also a lampoon of the incompetence and laziness of government officials. The movie actually is adapted from Liu Zhenyun's novel 我不是潘金莲. To amend the culture gap, the English translation replaces Pan Jinglian in the Chinese text with Madame Bovary. As both of the two fictional women characters are known in their respective native culture for promiscuity and infidelity. Pan Jinglian, a femme fatale in Water Margin, a 14th century Chinese novel about the outlaws community, conspired with her lover to murder her husband and ends up being killed by her brother-in-law. This morality tale about the unfaithful wife was so well known in China that Pan Jinglian became an idiom in popular language. Even nowadays, bad women are still referred to as Pan Jinglian. Li Xuelian's husband in the movie calls her Pan Jinglian in order to smear her reputation and excuse his decision of divorce and remarriage. Although Madame Bovary has similar cultural connotations to Western audience that Pan Jinglian does to Chinese audience, the English translation downplays the cultural context of the movie and erases the linkage between the contemporary Chinese society and Chinese traditions. In contrast, the movie actually tries to foreground this cultural context and linkage. The movie begins with a slideshow of illustrations of the moral tale, while the male voiceover retell Pan Jinglian's story. So these are the 6 slides shown at the beginning of the movie. The recount of the Pan Jinglian story evokes traditional Chinese culture, as well as foreshadows the fate of Li Xuelian and her husband. The uncanny between the contemporary Chinese society and Chinese tradition is a key theme in Li Xuelian's story. Such a linkage is also salient that China's 1,000-year history and traditions of bureaucratic hierarchy since the Song Dynasty have circumscribed the political system and practices of modern China. And the Chinese public, including Li Xuelian, are accustomed to negotiating with bureaucracy and seeking for a bureaucratic form of justice. So to understand Li Xuelian's struggle, we need to quickly go over the one-child policy and China's fertility control since the 1970s. Fertility control became a constitutional duty in China in 1982. So the state promotes family planning so that population growth may fit the plans for economic and social development, and that is written into the Chinese constitution. It also ratified in the marriage law of 1980, lays down the same obligations for couples. It says family planning should be practiced by every couple. However, the one-child policy was never a proper legislated issue, but rather a consequence of the shifting population control policy promoted by the CPR, the Communist Party of China, since the early 1970s. Actually, no legislation has been passed that applies the principle of family planning policy nationwide. Because of China's vastness and diversity, it actually became the responsibility of local officials to regulate fertility on the provincial basis. Therefore, in the 1980s, each province enacted its own self-contained family limitation regulations, leading to great variations in the content of regulations among provinces. Therefore, the enforcement of fertility control, as well as the struggle against fertility control, occurred mostly on provincial levels. Meanwhile, active enforcement actually failed to quell resistance to the family planning program. For example, the total number of reported births indicates substantial non-compliance. To measure resistance in the provinces, an indicator has been devised termed the indicator of family planning policy resistance. So there are various forms of resistance taking place on various levels. And Li Xuelian's case, right, the fictional story of Li Xuelian, showcases such resistance. Her divorce scheme intends to circumvent the law to have a second child. But ironically, her fake divorce is certified and cemented by another law, that is the marriage law. Whereas she's clearly not applauded for being a law-abiding citizen, her sorrow and suffering is incurred under the draconian law that deprives her of reproductive justice in the first place. After the county court rejects her plea to nullify her divorce, her case falls into the interstice between the legal system and the administrative state. Li Xuelian sees herself being wronged because of both legal malpractice and negligence. And she believes that only a bureaucratic form of justice could rectify the wrong and restore her reputation. Therefore, she embarks on a journey of petitioning. And we're going to into a brief discussions about the system of petitioning in China, which is also called Xinfang, or letters and visits system. And this system allows Chinese citizens to petition the authorities in paper on paper or in person. It is a form of social resistance in which the masses use state policies to struggle with negligent and delinquent local officials. And in this sense, the practice is termed rightful resistance by scholars. Recently, a lot of studies confirm that the letters and visits system provides a channel for citizens to raise useful complaints, spurring local governments to make substantial improvements. In this way, the system introduces a measure of checks and balance into the Chinese authoritarian regime. There are two categories of petitions considered by the officials. One is regular petitions and the other being irregular petitions. Regular petitions are those that conforms to the relevant guidelines in the letters and visits regulations, in that they are directed at officially designated bureaus to handle letters and visits. And then those petitions are passed up the hierarchy step by step. And then irregular petitions are complaints that refuse to pass through the hierarchies and go directly to the top, usually the bureaus of letters and visits in Beijing. So many citizens take their grievances directly to Beijing, and those petitions are deemed to have not been filed according to the law, therefore irregular petitions. And in Li Xuelian's case, because she doesn't trust the local government and the officials, so she wants to take her case and plead the case directly with officials in Beijing. Therefore, right, her case is also deemed as irregular petitions and handled with measures, right, that seem proper for irregular petitions. In terms of the handling of irregular petitions, right, the governing principle in handling that is to maintain social stability at all costs, which often involves both soft and hard approaches. So here I'm borrowing a figure from Liang and Cao's 2019 article to really illustrate the two types of handlings of irregular petitions in China. And those two types of handlings are both soft and hard approaches. The soft tricks include actual bribery, emotional bribery, and persuasions via friends, relatives, family members, whereas the hard measures include restrictions on entering Beijing, forced returns and detention, and even persecutions in extreme cases. The biggest difference between the soft and hard approaches is that soft measures focus on psychological manipulation that encourage petitioners to withdraw their complaints voluntarily, whereas the hard approach, on the other hand, involves physical coercion, right, such as forcing petitioners to leave Beijing. The state usually employs the police, military units, the courts, or other coercive institutions to carry out such hard measures. In the movie, right, Li Xuelian's case is handled with both soft tricks and hard approaches by the official. Just to give two examples, in terms of soft tricks, the authorities actually conspired with her boyfriend and set up a honey trap to distract her from petitioning. So here is this screenshot from the movie, right? The boyfriend actually takes her to a tour to the Yellow Mountain so that, right, she's distracted from her mission of petitioning to Beijing. And then a case or example of hard approaches is they set up police checkpoints on the highway to Beijing. So there are police officers to check the the list of passengers on each shuttle bus, and they actually spotted Li Xuelian on this bus and blocked her from actually entering Beijing. So these are two examples to showcase the different handlings of irregular petitions. And finally, what I want to briefly discuss is also the use of circular frame throughout the movie. And this is, again, a screenshot from the movie to showcase the use of circular frame, which cuts off the peripheries of the screen. And this kind of technique is used throughout the movie. Overall, the visual effect created by this strict framing is a distancing device that prevents the audience from immersing into the cinematic world. Instead, they have to stay vigilant about their own positionality and limited perception as bystanders or voyeurs. More importantly, the use of circular frame mimics the framing techniques that is often used in classic Chinese painting and landscape design. That is to say, traditional Chinese culture deployed it as a lens to view the story of Li Xuelian. The video effect also symbolized a compressed social, culture, and legal space that constrains Li Xuelian's mobility, agency, and his fights for reproductive justice. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Lina. Moving on, I'd like to invite Lauren and Sarah to the room to present.
Okay, sorry, my very cheap webcam from Amazon just fell off my computer at the exact time that you introduced us, so let's get it.
How it always works.
Yep, let me pull up my screen here. Are you guys seeing presenter view or regular view?
It's still set up so that we can see all the slides. It's not in view mode.
Okay. How about now?
Nope.
Nope. Sorry, guys.
Just one more second.
Lauren, you may need to unshare and then reshare. Sometimes that'll do it.
Okay. I think the problem is with my monitor. Can you guys still not see it?
We can see the presentation, but it's not in view mode.
Dang, okay.
No.
It says sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front.
Yeah, I think if you maybe unshare your full screen and then reshare with that window up, that might do it.
Okay. I have that window up. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry, guys. That was fun. Okay. So along with my illustrious colleague, Sarah, and our fearless leader, Mara, who is a political science professor at the University of Michigan, we've been looking at this complex phenomenon of women not supporting policies that patently benefit their in-group in the same way that we see other marginalized groups doing. So I'm a PhD candidate in communication and media, and Sarah is a PhD candidate in political science at Michigan. And today we're going to unpack for you the first part of a research project we have underway to explore some of the possible mechanisms behind why women might be voting against their own interests. So if you have been anywhere other than under a rock the past few weeks, you know that this has been a politically interesting November. And we saw again the vote of women, especially white women's vote, diverge from what we would expect with other marginalized groups. Generally speaking, you can predict the majority of a marginalized group's voting behavior in accordance with whichever party is perceived as being more supportive of that group's interests. And yet women consistently, and more than any other group, vote for these programs and policies and politicians that are embodiments of gender inequality. And this is especially fascinating to us because the literature has tackled theories that explain why African Americans might vote against their interests, why Latinos might vote against their interests, the complexity of those votes, why the few LGBTQIA conservatives vote conservative. But this area of the literature has yet to be tapped for women. And of course, this is predominantly a white woman's problem. We're so good at being the problem. But it's also striking to me that 30% of Latinx women voted for Trump this time around, and 10% of Black women. These are comparatively small numbers, but this also tells us that there's an ongoing contingency of even women of color who continue to vote for policies that are in opposition to women's interests. So one of the explanations that has gotten a lot of play in the literature is that, okay, if I'm not aware my group is being marginalized, if I don't perceive that I'm being discriminated against, then there'd be no reason for me to support policies beneficial to the in-group. I have to believe that discrimination exists in order to support a policy attempted to combat it. However, even in 2020, the year of our Lord 2020, some data from Pew from a few months ago indicates that fully 1/3 of women think that the US is done. Okay, awesome. We have no more work to do when it comes to achieving gender equity. Some of these women even say that the US has gone too far towards gender equity. This is the case even where women are aware of realities like the wage gap, like pervasive sexual harassment. So while this might be the case for a few women, we know that this is not the mechanism driving a lot of women to vote against their interests. Another explanation in the literature points to political partisanship. Again, for other marginalized groups, it is likely that the party that is perceived as being the most beneficial to that in-group is going to receive the majority of that group's votes. And so the partisanship there aligns with the marginalized identity and tends to make kind of congruent sense. Here, however, you have this contingency of women remaining staunchly Republican despite an infrastructure at every level, from voters to women's own candidacies, and an electorate itself that are rife with inequity. And the partisanship itself doesn't have the kind of explanatory capacity that we're so often used to seeing in the political science literature. So that may explain some of it, but it can't explain all of it, so we'll keep digging. Religious identity has also been linked with political views and with underlying marginalized groups' votes against their own interests. And this certainly makes a lot of sense thinking about the white evangelical bloc and its ever-growing influence in American politics. And while religion does remain hugely impactful on the political scene, religiosity actually isn't always a reliable predictor of women's political attitudes. There's new work coming out this year from Hope College that also untangles this and problematizes the correlation that we previously believed existed between religiosity and conservatism. So, okay, all these things might apply to some women, but we're seeing that there's a lot of women that they don't explain why those women would vote against their own interests. So of course, the big one is race. And as we saw from the first slide, white women are by far the most likely to vote against their interests as women in order to vote racial alignment. And you'll note that the line on this one is dotted because race is still hugely important and hugely impactful, and is a powerful predictor of women's behavior in many cases. Did my thing just go off? Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
But the video's
Amazon guys. But we have this small cluster of Republican women of color that's enduring and we have the white women who do support pro-women policies. I want to be sure and pay due allegiance here to Kimberly Crenshaw and works building on her seminal piece discussing the ways in which movement for women's equality and movement for racial equality have been pitted against each other by the patriarchy historically in order to prevent the flourishing of either. So these things are very intimately bound up. We're looking at an additional mechanism beyond race that could help explain why women don't support in-group policies when race isn't the defining factor. So this brings us to family socialization. Political scientists have long, like half a century long, pointed to family as the most intensive source of political polarization. My camera turned off again. Okay, sorry. Fun times, guys. I'm so sorry. Okay, so for one, if all of these other explanations don't work, we probably really need to locate women within the context within which they hold particular views. So not just individual women and what they happen to check at the ballot box, but the contexts that are shaping their political identities and their political attitudes. This is probably the only way that we can get some real insight into why women as a collective don't have that group consciousness that is powerfully predictive of the voting behavior of other disadvantaged groups. As we were digging into this literature, a very striking difference became clear, and that is that other marginalized groups are very often socialized in majority in-group communities. For example, African American women are most likely, I'm just going to keep turning it back on. African American women are most likely to be raised in a household with other African Americans, maybe even within an African American community, in a predominantly Black church, going to a predominantly Black school. Women, on the other hand, are not socialized with other members of the in-group. They're not segregated by gender. They often live in households that are not only inclusive of men, but oftentimes dominated and constrained by men's interests. And that's of course true as we scale up to think about communities and social systems at large. So if this is a key difference, and we know how important context is, we began to see this as a potential insight into understanding why women's ideology doesn't make sense sometimes and why old explanations don't make sense. So recent work has demonstrated that for the majority of the population, a intensely illustrative ideology that makes congruent logical sense is not actually what's driving most people's voting decisions. Most of the time, it's those contextual attachments and antagonisms, or the kind of costs and the benefits of holding particular political views. And that leads us to this idea of perceived relational cost, which is not that women themselves necessarily are conservative, but that if I believe that holding a liberal view would be looked on unfavorably by my family, I'm going to be less likely to support that liberal view than would a woman who doesn't think that would have any negative consequences in her family. So out of that comes our first hypothesis, and that's just that women who believe that their family would not approve of them holding liberal attitudes are going to be more likely to oppose policies that promote gender equality, controlling for other variables. By the same token, as we've seen, these other explanations don't explain for women to vote against their interests, that even if we take the subset of our sample who is aware of gender inequality, who acknowledges it, still this belief in the cost in your family, that your family would look unfavorably on your views, that mechanism is still going to be strong enough to make women more likely to oppose policies than would women in more supportive families. With that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Sarah, who has a far superior camera, and she'll discuss the methods and results by which we further engage these questions.
Great. So in order to look at the role of family socialization and specifically perceptions of sort of family cost, we employed a survey of 2007 respondents using the survey platform Donata. And the purpose of the survey was to evaluate the relationship between perceptions of your family's political attitudes or family cost and support for policies that benefit or support gender equality. And the benefit of a survey is we're also able to account for a number of the other explanations that Lauren discussed earlier in the presentation, as well as 2 other forms of community socialization, namely religious socialization in a religious community and perceptions of the marriage market, or the perceptions of the impact of support for gender policies on the marriage market for heterosexual women. So the demographics of the survey were relatively similar to the American National Election Study, which is a nationally representative survey conducted every 4 years out of the University of Michigan. However, to make sure that there weren't differences across either partisanship or race, we also looked at the results across Democrats, Republicans, and Independents separately, as well as across 4 different racial or ethnic groups. We looked at the results across white Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic and Latinx Americans, and Asian Americans. The survey is done entirely on women. And so we asked 10 questions to evaluate their policy attitudes, ranging from questions asking their opinions on whether men should suffer in their careers for the behaviors they engaged in as boys, whether employers have a right or should be required to conduct equal, pay men and women equally, whether more needs to be done to combat sexual assault on college campuses. And we intentionally labeled some of these questions to be sort of issues that promote gender equality, and then intentionally half of the questions are phrased in a way that is sort of in opposition to gender equality. Lauren, can you go to the next slide? And so then to evaluate the role of family socialization, we asked each respondent to reflect on how their family would feel if they held a series of liberal or conservative attitudes on gender, ranging from voting for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton in 2016 to things like supporting equal pay or being pro-life. And again, we balanced these across sort of attitudes that promote gender equality and attitudes that are in opposition to gender equality. Next slide. And so then in order to test the second hypothesis, which was that you have to actually be aware or believe that gender inequality is an issue in order to support policies that work to end or lessen gender inequality, we also asked belief in a series of sort of factually accurate statements about gender inequality in the US. So things like, do you believe that at least 1 in 6 women in the United States has experienced some form of sexual assault? Or do you actually believe that women are paid less than men to do similar work? And this was to evaluate the extent to which they believe factually accurate statements about gender inequality in the United States. And then in order to control for a number of alternative explanations, we also asked demographic questions as well as psychological controls such as hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, religiosity, and belief in a just world. These are factors that political science has found to shape how individuals' policy preferences are developed, particularly in relation to gender policies. Next slide. And so what we did find was a unique, strong and statistically significant effect of perceptions of family cost over and above these other community costs, such as the perceptions of the marriage market or perceptions of one's religious community, on opposition to policies that promote gender equality. And what we found was that women who perceive that their family will look unfavorably on supporting these policies are far more less likely to support them as a result. And this is after controlling for a range of both demographic and psychological factors. And so this is just a marginal effects plot. So it looks at sort of the effect size of the different variables once controlling for alternative explanations. And so what you'll see is family cost is the 5th variable across the x-axis. And what we find is that even after controlling for these demographic factors like age and marital status and party ID, and psychological factors like hostile sexism and benevolent sexism, family cost, so perceptions of your family's attitudes towards these beliefs, remains both positive and statistically significant, which means it doesn't cross the sort of 0 line, even when accounting for these relevant controls. We then ran the same analyses looking only at women who believe that gender inequality is an issue, and found that family cost continues to remain positive and statistically significant, even among people who are aware that issues like equal pay and sexual assault continue to remain unequal for women in the society today. So our next steps, so a survey can only seek to show that people who are high in family cost are also high in opposition to these policies, but can't really account for a number of other explanations for why both of those things might be the case. And so we've received funding to run an experiment on 800 teenagers that's going to it's going to be a reflection task where they reflect on their family's political attitudes towards the Me Too movement, and look at how reflecting on your family's political attitudes towards gender policy shapes ultimate attitudes towards a series of different items like the ones in our survey. We're really looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and relevant presentation, Lauren and Sarah. I really appreciate it. So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you like to enter your question in the chat section, please feel free to do so. Or you can raise your hand by clicking on the participant icon, and you should have an ability to raise your hand. So please, anyone who has a question, please go ahead. I know it's always unnerving to be the first person, even over Zoom, or especially on Zoom. It's kind of unnerving, but I'm sure the presenters would welcome any questions. So I have one question. So that it's about the last presentation by Sarah and Lauren. The question is there a difference between privately held beliefs and publicly professed ones? For instance, did you find women who were reluctant to publicly state progressive views, though they believed them secretly?
So our survey definitely can't tell the difference between whether the process by which family cost works is that it's sort of early stage family socialization, such that conservative women develop these attitudes at a young age, and therefore they are both publicly and privately held beliefs, or whether family cost serves as a moderating effect, such that women may hold more progressive views than they are willing to state publicly because of the impacts of their family. I am inclined to believe that it is the former and not the latter, that this is about how family socialization at a young age, sort of existing in a space which is male dominated or not segregated by gender, leads to sort of early stage development of policies that promote gender inequality. But I do want to be clear that there is a limitation to the survey, that we can't actually look at that, and that would be a really interesting question to explore with future research.
Lauren, would you like to respond as well, or?
No, I think Sarah did a great job. Thank you.
So another question I have here is, just wanted to say thank you for a very broad-ranging set of papers across literature, film. I think it's more of a comment. I'm interested in potential parallels between suffragism and white slavery in the UK and the US, given the different racial politics of each. Another comment that is a question for Anna. So the connection between white slavery and the white women-led suffrage movement is so interesting. I know in the United States, many famous suffragists, Anthony in particular, at times blatantly racist in their language. Did you ever see this in your research, or was it all more subtle?
Anna,
I think you're still on mute.
I swear I click it and it just doesn't go through. Thank you, Natalia. So I'm going to kind of address both. So yes, there are a lot of parallels between the UK and US white slavery panics. Actually, they're rooted in the same cause. So that 1885 maiden tribute of Modern Babylon that got published by William T. Stead was actually republished that same year in the US, and that kicked off a whole bunch of panic and concern over white slavery as well. There's a bunch of literature on it in the US, but actually not that much in the UK, which is part of the reason why I found it so interesting to study white slavery in the English context. So yeah, there's a bunch of parallels, and it's really interesting how they've kind of evolved in different ways. famous suffragettes being blatantly racist in the US, absolutely. That also happened in the UK. I think what's quite different about the UK context, at least from my perspective, is that I haven't gone in to study suffrage and race specifically. I've gone in studying white slavery, and that is much more subtle. I would say something that is really interesting that I've noticed just doing that line of inquiry is that for the UK, because there's such a strong sense of empire, right? And at this time when you're basically arguing for suffrage, the idea of extending that beyond the actual British border was almost like unthinkable. It was so far outside the norm that it wasn't something that was brought up very often. So the racialization process almost happens where you have this kind of increased immigration to the UK around the beginning of the 20th century. And that's what sparks these conversations and the kind of racist remarks by British suffragettes. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
I cannot raise my hand. I don't know. I'm sorry. I think because we're hosts, but if I can add to that question, comment. So I study a period that is much more recent, but my impression from the American suffragettes and their relates to race, which I have seen a little bit just because of the parallels with the 60s and 70s, is that it's not a very good explanation, like the inherent racism of some of the actors, which might have been the case, but there are a lot of just alliances and turnings in the political, just like alliances and discourse and who you are working with and against who. So like even within the suffragettes, of course, there were different perspectives from different people, but also like the same people in different moments in time changed their alliances and their discourses, perhaps responding to changing intuitions or to the social context. Like, do you think that happens? Do you feel that happens too in the UK?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, yeah, Josephine Butler is actually a really interesting example of that, because it's very much politically motivated as well in the kind of alliances that you're talking about. Like, I think, she was involved with the National Vigilance Association for the first about like 8 or 9 years of its operation. And that was also before it really started to advocate for these anti-immigrant policies. So she saw them shifting towards this more police state kind of version where they were much more concerned about the borders and policing those spaces and monitoring women themselves, and kind of pulled herself back from it. But she never formally denounced them, and she never thought about race as a compounding factor within that discussion. She very much saw it as an issue of women's bodily autonomy. And so like she's somebody that I think would be a good example of exactly what you're talking about in terms of kind of having these shifting political needs or discussions or just the windows that are available at the time.
Next question is for Lina. I was wondering if you could speak to the popularity of the film and its reception from the public.
Yeah, thanks for the question. In terms of box office gain, I would say that movie was quite popular domestically and globally because it also received a international cinema award. I really want to kind of clarify a certain change in the movie, like a change from the original novel, is the movie actually tries to downplay the real motive or the truth about Alicia Lian's fake divorce, that is to, fake the divorce so that they could have a second child. It only, that secret is only disclosed, way up until the end of the movie. But the novel actually begins with that plot. So the movie adaptation definitely tries to downplay that. I think for various purpose, one would possibly to circumvent the censorship in China. Yeah.
So there is a question, another one in chat box, relative to the discussion about parallels. I wonder also about the parallels between white supremacy in suffragist discourse and recent discussions of femonationalism, and how feminist theory can become complicit in that, thinking about Sarah Farris's work. I think it is really a question open to any panelist.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's super interesting. That's kind of where I'm headed with this project in general. I haven't read Sarah Farris's work specifically, although I definitely just made a note to do that. But I think what's really fascinating is the way that right now a lot of feminationalist projects, which are kind of this feminism, well, it's basically nationalist expansion under the guise of feminism, right, and feminist exploits. It's continuing, and I would say that actually the Modern Slavery Act is one part of that, right? Like that's what got me interested in this act in particular. It's the first one that expands outside of Britain's borders to monitor businesses in other countries. So that's quite a clear expansion of nation and national borders through the law, using human trafficking as this kind of reasoning for it. But yes, I think that's a really wonderful suggestion. So thank you for bringing that up.
I also haven't read her work, but definitely will now. And if I can add something, yes, that definitely echoes, and I think it's a very interesting reflection, but also like the inside, I don't know if imperialism is the correct word just because it's within the borders, but a lot of feminist conquests have been with illegal immigrants taking over precarious works, right? So the white women CEO can shine in the whatever Google landscape you have, and overexploited, underpaid women that, and this is not, of course, to vilify anyone, but there are some dynamics in which the cost of getting women to the same place white men used to occupy has a lot of times kept women sticking in the floor mat and not in this breaking, well, some are trying to break this glass ceiling. So also there are problems of internal periphery that I think are very important in feminist discussions today, and that have sometimes left the spotlight because of these issues.
As a question for Sarah and Lauren, I believe I noticed a change of word choice during your talk. Lauren was mostly speaking about women, quote unquote, voting against their interest, while Sarah spoke mostly about concerns with, quote unquote, gender inequality. Would you maybe explain what concept of interest you are using, and particularly how you construe this objective concept of interest?
So I can speak first and then pass it off to Sarah if that works. So thank you for bringing that up. We have in our paper kind of a layout of these, what we're calling pro-women policies. And we're thinking about those in terms of the things that would legally help women to be on par with men, or socially help women to have a social experience more on par with that of men in the US. So things like an equal pay for equal work, things like the military doing more to integrate women, things like greater protections for victims of sexual harassment, etc. So I think Sarah and I probably mean the same thing, where we're thinking about women's interests as being whatever advances women's legal rights, and especially the right to choose, reproductive rights, etc. And then we see gender inequality as part and parcel of that same idea, where without equality before the law, without equality in lived experience, it's really hard for us to be moving toward women's interests as well. So I think we see those as bound up together.
Yeah, I want to affirm everything that Lauren just said. I think it also is a good reminder for us because we do have 10 different policy questions that sort of range from, I think, things that are like very specifically governmental policy. So government requiring that businesses like equally pay men and women, to things that are sort of more attitudinal, such as that more should be done to combat sexual assault on college campuses, that there is room within our survey to look at how there might be differences across things that are more attitudinal versus more either policy driven or even in the case of voting against your interest, like vote choice driven. So that might result in particular partisan or voting behaviors down the line.
Thank you for those responses. Although I have my own questions that I like to share with everybody so that in case the presenters are interested in, Natalia and Lina, you will have a chance to think about it, or maybe you can email me later on. But in the interest of time, and I want to be respectful to everybody's schedule, I like to thank all the panelists again and all the participants who stayed in and asked many questions and engaged in a stimulating discussion. So thank you very much for everybody. And I hope to see many of you in the later sessions in this afternoon.